All right, so welcome to this deep dive. And today we are really going back in time.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about ancient Greek wine. And,
Okay.
um, I think, we all have this image in our heads of like vineyards and,
Sure.
wine tastings and sommeliers and stuff. But
Yeah.
we're going to learn today that wine in ancient Greece was really,
Right.
it was like a cultural cornerstone.
It really was.
And we have all these different sources that we're looking at, historical accounts. We've got analyses of ancient art, all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And what I really think is interesting is we're going to see how wine wasn't just a drink. It was like
Right.
it was part of everything.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, like you said, we tend to think of, kind of the modern trappings of wine, but for the ancient Greeks, it was intertwined with everything, with
Right.
their religion, their economy, their social fabric. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a far cry from just, grabbing a bottle at the store.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And one of the things that just jumps out right away
Sure.
is the god of wine, Dionysus.
Right, right.
Um, he wasn't just about having a good time, though.
No, 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 no.
Like,
There's
it-
much more to it.
yeah, there's more to him than that.
Much more to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
He represented ecstasy,
Okay.
breaking social norms,
Interesting.
and even connecting with the divine. So,
Sure.
think of him as the ultimate party god,
Right.
but with a spiritual side.
Right. Okay.
And wine was a key part of these festivals in his honor. So
Okay.
it's almost like they used it as a conduit to the gods themselves.
So not your average wine tasting.
No, not at all.
More like a spiritual experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
Wine in ancient Greece was surprisingly democratic.
Really?
Yeah, all social classes drank it,
Wow.
which isn't something you see in every ancient culture.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Although our sources say that it was considered, uncivilized
Right.
to drink it straight,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
and that mixing it with water was,
Absolutely.
not only the norm, but seen as like a sign of refinement,
Yeah.
not just like watering it down.
Yeah, it's a great point.
It's interesting.
And it speaks to how deeply ingrained wine was in their culture.
Right.
Like, even the way they consumed it reflected their values.
Right.
Yeah, but you're right. There were some social nuances at play there, too.
Of course.
While everyone might have enjoyed wine, the elite,
Yeah.
they had access to the good stuff, the
Right.
aged wines, the imported varieties.
Right. Right.
Yeah, so it's kind of like how we have
So
that,
the good stuff.
our everyday wines
yeah.
and then the special bottles that we save
Exactly.
for an important occasion or something like that.
Yep.
And back then, your access to those finer wines
Mm.
was a very clear sign of your social standing.
So there was that kind of wine snob factor,
Yeah.
even back then.
There was, yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
Some things never change.
I guess not.
Yeah.
And our sources also mentioned that slaves
Right.
were mostly excluded from enjoying wine. Their access was extremely limited.
Yeah, it's a very powerful connection. And it
Wow.
makes you think about how, even today,
Right.
access to certain foods and drinks
Mhm.
can reflect social inequalities, really.
They really can.
But let's move on to something that really surprised me.
Okay.
When I was reading through these sources,
Okay.
did you know that the ancient Greeks had laws
Really?
specifically about wine?
Wine laws. That's so interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I never would have thought about that.
Yeah.
Like, what do they consider good wine, bad wine? Who got to decide? What kind of things did they regulate?
Well, for one, they had restrictions on who could drink in
Okay.
some city-states.
Uh-huh.
Women and young people weren't allowed to drink wine, except during specific religious festivals,
Interesting.
which, when you think about it, really highlights how those laws reflected the social norms of the time.
Yeah.
Women and young people
Right.
were often excluded from many aspects of public life.
Wow. It's just so fascinating how much we can learn about their values
I know, it's incredible.
and priorities just from these laws.
Yeah. It's like a window into their world.
It really is. What else did these wine laws regulate?
Well, public drunkenness was a big no-no.
Okay.
There were fines,
Uh,
even physical punishments for getting too rowdy.
oh, wow.
And it wasn't just about keeping the peace.
Okay.
They also had regulations for the wine trade itself,
Okay.
showing an early concern for quality control and preventing fraud.
That's interesting. It makes me think about all the scandals that you see today
Right.
with counterfeit wines.
Exactly. Some things never change.
It seems like people have always been trying to
Always.
cut corners, even with wine.
Always trying to cut corners. Yeah.
But it makes sense that they'd want to protect the integrity of their wine,
Of course.
especially considering how important it was to their economy.
Exactly.
We mentioned earlier, the trade routes, how they were shipping it all over the Mediterranean.
Yeah, ancient Greece was a major player
Wow.
in the global wine trade.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
We're talking sea routes, land routes.
Okay.
A whole network moving wine all over the ancient world.
So those amphoras, those big clay jars that you see in museums,
Right, exactly.
those weren't just for storage. They were like the shipping containers.
Yeah, the shipping containers of their time.
Wow.
Yeah, and get this. They use those amphoras almost like ancient wine labels.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh. The shape, the markings,
Okay.
all of that provided information on the wine's origin and quality.
So like a clay version of a fancy wine label that you see today.
Precisely.
That's so cool.
It highlights their ingenuity,
Yeah.
and it shows how important branding and quality were, even back then.
Even back then.
Yeah.
Wow.
But let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about how they actually made this wine
Okay, I'm ready.
that was so vital to their culture and their economy.
Yeah.
So, are you ready for a crash course
I
in
am.
ancient winemaking?
Let's do it.
All right, so imagine this. It all started with foot-stomped grapes.
Foot stomp.
Foot-stomped.
Like they literally crushed the grapes with their feet.
You got it.
Wow.
A very hands-on and probably very messy
so what I meant.
approach, but it was effective.
Okay.
So they'd crush the grapes with their feet to release the juice, or the must, as it's called.
Okay.
And then that must went into these large clay jars
Okay.
called pithoi for fermentation.
So no fancy stainless steel tanks.
Nope.
Or temperature-controlled rooms back then.
No, not at all.
Wow.
Those pithoi, those were their fermentation vessels, and they
Oh,
were
yeah.
pretty clever about using them, too.
Okay.
They would partially bury those pithoi underground, which acted like a natural cellar,
Okay.
keeping the fermenting wine cooler and more stable.
Oh, so they were already thinking about temperature control
Exactly.
all those years ago.
Yeah, very ingenious.
Wow, that's fascinating. So what happened after fermentation?
Right.
Was the wine ready to drink?
Well, that depended on the type of wine.
Okay.
Some wines were drunk young and fresh,
Okay.
while others were aged for months or even years.
Oh, wow.
And they aged the wine in those sealed amphoras,
Uh-huh.
preventing oxidation and letting the wine mature.
Okay.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about resin-flavored wine?
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the pine resin they added for preservation and flavor.
Yeah, you might think pine resin sounds odd,
Right.
but, imagine a world without refrigeration.
Exactly.
Resin acted like an ancient preservative,
It did, yep.
and it gave this distinct flavor that might have masked any off flavors
Right.
in wine that wasn't aged as carefully as today's vintages. So
Yeah, it makes sense.
it makes sense why it was popular.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't just some random ingredient. It was practical
Mhm.
and a flavor component all in one.
Yeah.
So it really speaks to how resourceful they were.
Right.
They used what they had available
Yep.
to create a product that was both enjoyable and safe to drink.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So they had these resin-flavored wines.
Right.
But what other kinds of wines were they making?
Sure.
Was it just the basic red, white, and rosé?
Well, they had
Or did they have more variety than that?
a pretty diverse selection.
Okay.
Red, white, rosé, the classics were all there.
Uh-huh.
But they also made sweet wines
Okay.
using techniques that concentrated the natural sugars in the grapes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they'd sun-dry the grapes to concentrate their sweetness,
Okay.
almost like making raisins,
Wow.
but for wine.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what those ancient dessert wines
I know.
tasted like compared to a modern ice wine or something.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think about all the different flavors
I know.
that they were experimenting with all those years ago.
It really is.
But I have a feeling that wine wasn't just about
Right.
everyday drinking and festivals
Yeah.
in ancient Greece. Am I right?
You are absolutely right.
Yeah.
Wine played a major role
Okay.
in their high culture as well.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
Take the symposia, for example.
Okay.
These gatherings weren't just about getting drunk. They
Okay.
were intellectual events
Okay.
where philosophical debates
Right.
were fueled by,
I heard.
diluted, of course.
Right, of course. So like ancient Greece's version of a TED Talk,
Exactly.
but with more wine and togas.
Exactly. Yeah, it was
Wow.
wine wasn't just a fuel for discussion, it was a muse.
Right.
Poets like Homer and Sappho celebrated it in their works, and philosophers pondered its effects,
Interesting.
both good and bad, showing a very sophisticated understanding of its role in society.
So it seems like we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this topic.
Oh, we have, yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Well, we've talked about how wine was made and enjoyed,
Right.
but what about its lasting impact?
Okay.
How has this ancient tradition shaped our modern world of wine?
Right.
That's what we'll be discussing after the break.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were really getting into some of the details of ancient Greek winemaking.
We were.
From foot-stomped grapes
Yeah.
to those pithoi for fermentation.
Right.
It's clear that wine wasn't just a drink to them.
It wasn't, no.
It was really embedded in their entire culture.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is this link between what we drink and our place in society.
Right.
It's not unique to ancient Greece.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it all the time, even today.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Like, think about how we perceive certain drinks.
Right.
Some just scream luxury, while others are more every day.
Yeah.
Like champagne.
Right.
It's always tied to celebration or wealth or even power.
Yeah.
You don't really crack open a bottle of bubbly
You don't.
with your Tuesday night takeout.
No, not really.
Yeah.
Or how certain craft beers have become almost like status symbols.
Right.
For those in the know,
Exactly.
it's a subtle way of signaling that
Yeah.
you're part of a specific group,
Yeah.
that you have a certain level of knowledge or taste.
Right.
It's incredible how these seemingly simple drink choices
Yeah.
can be so revealing about social dynamics,
Right.
both then and now.
It really makes you think.
It does.
Okay, but let's circle back to those ancient Greek wine laws.
Okay.
It's not something that you would really expect
Right.
from such a long time ago.
You wouldn't.
Regulations on who could drink,
Right.
how wine was made and sold.
Uh-huh.
It makes you wonder what life was like back then.
It does, you're right.
Yeah.
We often think of those kinds of regulations as modern inventions.
Right.
But clearly they've been around for centuries.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating to see how those ancient laws reflect the social norms of the time.
Right. So we talked about how women and young people were often restricted from drinking.
Right, which echoes their limited roles
Right.
in public life back then.
Right. Exactly. But what about the regulations on the wine itself?
Sure.
Did they have standards for quality or ways to prevent someone from, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, selling you watered down wine?
Absolutely. They were very concerned about quality control
Okay.
and preventing fraud. Yeah, they wanted to make sure that the wine wasn't adulterated
Right.
or misrepresented.
Right.
They had systems in place to ensure that people were getting what they paid for.
Right.
The real deal.
Not some ancient Greek version of bathtub wine.
Exactly, yeah.
That's hilarious.
It seems like people have always been trying to cut corners,
Yeah.
even when it comes to wine.
Yeah. But it makes sense, especially considering how important wine was
Of course.
to their economy.
It was-
We mentioned the trade routes earlier.
Right.
How they were shipping wine all over the Mediterranean.
They were, yeah.
Protecting the quality of their product
Yeah.
was probably key to their success.
Exactly. It wasn't just about local consumption.
Right.
They were exporting their wines, building a reputation,
Yeah.
and contributing to the larger ancient world economy.
So those amphoras we were
Yeah.
talking about,
Yeah.
more than just containers.
They were, yeah.
They were really like ancient wine labels,
They were, precisely.
providing information about the wine's origin and quality.
Exactly.
It's amazing how they use such a simple object
That is.
to convey so much information.
It is.
It really highlights how much thought and care went into their winemaking process.
It really does.
Okay, so we've covered kind of the social and economic aspects,
We have.
but I'm really curious about the actual process
Sure.
of turning those grapes into wine.
Right.
What were their techniques like? I mean, we left off with the image of foot-stomped grapes,
Yeah.
which is a far cry from the modern winemaking equipment we see today.
It is. It's very hands-on. Foot stomping was
Yeah.
probably quite a messy job,
Yeah.
but it served its purpose.
Right.
And once they had that freshly pressed juice, the must, as it's called,
Okay.
it was time for fermentation.
Okay.
And this took place in those large clay jars we mentioned,
Right.
the pithoi.
So no fancy stainless steel tanks
Nope,
or temperature-controlled rooms back then?
not at all. Just those big clay jars.
Just those big clay jars. Wow.
That's right.
And they really understood how to use those pithoi to their advantage
They did.
by partially burying them underground.
Uh-huh.
They created a natural cellar,
They did.
keeping the fermenting wine at a relatively stable temperature.
Right.
It's a technique that still resonates with some winemakers today
It does, yeah.
who are looking for those more natural, traditional methods.
Yeah, exactly.
So ancient techniques still influencing modern practices.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool.
It is.
Okay, so the wine is fermented.
Okay.
What happens next?
Well, at that point, it really depends on the style of wine.
Okay.
Some were enjoyed young and fresh, while others were aged for months or even years in sealed amphoras
Okay.
to develop more complex flavors.
And here's where we get back to that resin-flavored wine.
Right.
It wasn't just a random ingredient that they threw in.
It wasn't, no.
That pine resin played a significant role
It did.
in the flavor profile
It really did.
of those ancient white wines.
Yep.
So it wasn't just about preservation, it was an intentional flavor component.
It was, yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is.
What kind of flavor did it impart?
Well, imagine a piney, almost medicinal taste.
Okay.
It sounds a little odd
Yeah.
to modern palates,
Right.
but it was apparently quite popular at the time.
Interesting.
Yeah. Tastes change, don't they?
They do.
What might have been considered a delicacy back then might not appeal to us today.
Right.
It's a good reminder that taste preferences are constantly evolving.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So they had these resin-flavored whites.
Right.
But what about other types of wine?
Sure.
We know they had reds, whites, and rosés,
You did.
but did they get more creative than that?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
They were quite skilled at making sweet wines,
Okay.
often using techniques like sun-drying the grapes
Oh, wow.
to concentrate their natural sugars.
Okay.
Imagine grapes laid out in the Mediterranean sun,
Okay.
slowly shriveling and intensifying in sweetness.
Right.
And then they'd use those super sweet grapes
Yeah.
to make wines that were probably similar to modern dessert wines.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, like a port or a sauterne.
It's amazing how they figured out those techniques without access to modern technology.
I know it is.
They're really masters of working with what nature provided.
They were, yeah.
But I have to ask,
Sure.
did they ever drink their wines cold?
Right.
I can't imagine they had refrigeration back then.
You're right. Refrigeration was centuries away.
Right.
Most wines were likely enjoyed at room temperature.
Okay.
But they did have some clever methods for cooling drinks,
Okay.
especially during those hot Greek summers.
Okay.
They would store amphoras in cool cellars
Okay.
or bury them underground to take advantage of the Earth's natural coolness.
Right.
And they even used snow and ice collected from the mountains and
Oh.
stored in insulated containers.
Wow, they really thought of everything.
Talk about resourceful.
That's amazing.
I know.
So they had their reds, whites, rosés,
Uh-huh.
and sweet wines,
Uh-huh.
all potentially chilled
Yeah.
if they wanted to.
Yeah.
It sounds like they had quite the sophisticated drinking culture.
They did.
But we would be remiss if we didn't circle back to the
Yeah.
religious and philosophical significance of
Right.
wine in ancient Greece.
Yeah.
It was much more than just a beverage to them.
It was, absolutely. Wine was deeply intertwined with their beliefs
Right.
and their understanding of the world.
Yeah.
We talked about Dionysus, the god of wine,
Right.
and the wild festivals held in his honor.
Right.
And those festivals weren't just about getting drunk.
Right.
They were about connecting with the divine,
Right.
experiencing ecstasy,
Uh-huh.
and pushing social boundaries.
It's fascinating how wine could have this dual nature,
Yeah.
you know, a symbol of both everyday life and a pathway to the transcendent.
Right, exactly.
But it wasn't just the religious aspect.
Right.
Even the philosophers saw wine as a subject,
Yeah.
worthy of deep contemplation.
He did.
They were fascinated by its effects on the mind and body,
They were. Oh, absolutely.
weren't they?
Yeah. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle
Uh-huh.
pondered the role of wine in society,
Okay.
debating its potential benefits and drawbacks.
Okay.
They recognized its power
Right.
to stimulate conversation and inspire creativity,
Right.
but also acknowledged the dangers of excess.
Right. So they seem to have a very nuanced view of wine,
They did, yeah.
recognizing its power for both good and bad.
Uh-huh.
A perspective that is still relevant today.
It is, absolutely.
What do you say?
Yeah, it reminds us that even something as seemingly simple as a glass of wine
Right.
can have profound implications.
Wow.
But we've only scratched the surface of this
Yeah.
complex and fascinating topic.
Right.
When we return, we'll delve even deeper
Okay.
into the legacy of ancient Greek winemaking
Okay.
and explore how this ancient tradition continues to shape the world of wine today.
Welcome back to our deep dive into ancient Greek wine. I feel like we've really journeyed through time together,
We have.
From those lively Dionysian festivals to
Mm.
those philosophical musings of Plato and Aristotle.
Right.
It's clear that wine held a truly special place in their world.
It did, and what I find so remarkable is how this ancient tradition continues to resonate with us today.
Yeah.
It's not just a historical curiosity, it's a living legacy that influences the wines we drink and the way we think about wine culture.
So let's talk legacy. What are some of the tangible ways that ancient Greek winemaking still impacts us today?
Okay.
I mean, are we still sipping on the same wines they enjoyed thousands of years ago?
Well, you might be surprised to know that many of the grape varieties we enjoy today
Okay.
can trace their roots back to ancient Greece.
Really?
Think of grapes like a Certico,
Okay.
a Geritico,
Yes,
or a
yes.
Ginamavro. These have been cultivated in Greece for centuries,
Wow.
representing a direct link to that ancient world.
So next time I'm enjoying a glass of Certico,
Right.
I can imagine I'm tasting a bit of history,
You
a
are.
connection to those ancient vineyards and winemakers.
You are.
It's really incredible how those traditions have endured.
It is, and it's not just the grapes themselves.
Okay.
Some of the techniques pioneered by those ancient winemakers
Right.
are experiencing a revival today.
Really?
We talk about those amphoras,
Uh-huh.
those large clay jars they use
Yeah.
for fermentation and aging.
Right.
Well, now modern winemakers are experimenting with them again.
Wow, so everything old is new again.
It is. It seems that way.
What is it about those amphoras that's so appealing to modern winemakers?
Well, clay has this amazing ability
Okay.
to allow for slow, gentle oxygenation during the winemaking process.
Okay.
This can result in wines with a unique texture and complexity,
Okay.
a certain depth of flavor that you might not find in wines
Okay.
made with more modern techniques.
So it's almost like a fusion of ancient tradition
It is.
and modern innovation.
Exactly.
That's so fascinating.
It is.
So those ancient techniques are still relevant in the 21st century.
They are.
But what about the less tangible aspects of their wine culture?
Sure.
How did the ancient Greeks influence the way we think about wine today?
Well, think back to those symposia we discussed.
Oh, think-
Weren't just about drinking. They
Right.
were about intellectual discussion,
Uh-huh.
social bonding, and
Right.
celebrating life's pleasures.
Yeah.
The ancient Greeks saw wine as an integral part of those experiences.
Right.
And those associations have carried through to modern times.
It's true. Even today, we gather with friends and family
We do.
over a bottle of wine,
Yeah.
sharing stories and creating memories.
Yeah.
That sense of community, of connection,
Uh-huh.
seems deeply rooted in those ancient traditions.
It does, exactly. Wine has this incredible ability to bring people together.
Yeah.
And I think that's a legacy that can be traced back to the ancient Greeks.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the philosophical side of things?
Okay.
The ancient Greeks spent a lot of time contemplating the role of wine in society,
They did.
both its joys and its dangers.
Mm-hmm.
Does that still resonate with us today?
Absolutely. They weren't afraid to delve into the complexities of wine,
Right.
recognizing its potential for both good and bad.
Right.
Think of Dionysus, the god of wine,
Okay.
who embodied both the ecstatic revelry
Right.
and the potential for chaos that can
Yeah.
be associated with wine.
It's that duality,
It is.
that tension between pleasure and excess,
Mm-hmm.
that seems to be a timeless theme.
It is, yeah.
We still grapple with those ideas today.
Yeah, we do.
Wine can be a source of great joy and connection,
Uh-huh.
but it's important to approach it with respect and moderation.
Precisely. The ancient Greeks understood that balance.
Right.
And it's a lesson that we can still learn from today.
So as we wrap up our deep dive
Right.
into the world of ancient Greek wine,
Mm-hmm.
what's the one key takeaway you hope our listener will remember?
Well, I hope they'll remember that wine is so much more than just a drink.
Right.
It's a reflection of our history, our
Uh-huh.
culture, and our values.
Right.
And next time you enjoy a glass of wine,
Yeah.
I encourage you to take a moment and savor not just the flavors,
Right.
but the rich history and traditions that have led to that very moment.
Mm-hmm.
You might just find yourself transported back in time,
Yeah.
connecting with those ancient winemakers who, thousands of years ago, laid the foundation for the world of wine we enjoy today.
Beautifully put.
Thank you.
And with that, we raise a glass to the enduring legacy of ancient Greek winemaking.
Cheers.
Cheers.